I've always felt like 10-inch racks were, well, a bit of a gimmick, but I recently had an epiphany. Now, stick with me here, there's a lot of math, but you see 10 inches equals 254 millimeters, and the width of the print bed on my 3D printer is 256 millimeters. Now, if we run the calculations, we can find that 256 is greater than 254. Therefore, we should be able to 3D print components for this 10-inch rack. And, well, if we take 3D printing plus home labbing, that should equal lots of fun. At least that's the plan. So we're going to do a lot of 3D printing and build a little home lab in this rack, and it should be a good time. So stick around. So like I mentioned in the intro, I've always sort of felt like 10-inch racks were a bit of a very niche gimmick. I actually got really excited back when I watched a video from Nova Spirit Tech on his 10-inch rack, and I kind of wanted to build one of my own, but once I started looking into it, I realized there weren't a lot of options when it comes to hardware, and the options that did exist were a bit expensive, and so I just sort of moved on. But when GeekPie reached out to me to check this out, well, actually, I sort of said no, but then all of a sudden I had that epiphany that I was like, wait a second, I like 3D printing now, and 10 inches is technically smaller than the print bed on my X1 Carbon. Maybe I could 3D print some stuff. And sure enough, as soon as I started looking into it, I realized there was a pretty thriving community of people designing parts for 3D printing for 10-inch racks. And then I got kind of giddy and realized this could be pretty fun, so I reached back out and was like, hey, are you still interested in sending this out? And they were like, yeah. So pretty much this video is going to be very simple. I just 3D printed a lot of brackets and adapters and such, and we're going to build out a little home lab in this, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Now, don't get me wrong, I still do think 10-inch racks are very niche, and it's probably not the most cost-effective solution or the most rational solution in a lot of ways, but I do think it can be a lot of fun, especially with 3D printing. Now, elephant in the room, I probably should talk about what this thing is here. This is the Rackmate T1 from GeekPie, and it is an 8U 10-inch rack that has acrylic panels on the side, and it has these nice little carry handles on top. I believe it comes with 3 of just the blank panels, and then it also comes with just a blank tray, and then it comes with this little single board computer tray, which I believe can hold like 2 Raspberry Pis, or like Jets and Nanos, or a couple of other single board computers, I believe, which is pretty cool, I guess, if you're into single board computers, but, well, that's not what we're going to really do today. Oh, also at the top and on the bottom, I believe you can do it on the top. For sure on the bottom, you can mount, I think, a variety of different fans. So if you want, you could have some airflow pushing up to try to, pull all the hot air up. And I think you can mount fans up on the top as well. But yeah, overall, it's a pretty neat little thing. It comes with some pretty decent accessories out of the box. And you can also buy some more. Like, for example, you can buy this little Cat 6 12-port patch panel, which has 12 of these little Keystone Cat 6 couplers. And I think you can get this for like 20 bucks-ish, somewhere around there. So honestly, a pretty decent deal. It's only a half unit too, so you could get 2 of these and have 24 ports, or just only have it take up half of a rack unit. They also have a mini ITX board where you can mount a mini ITX motherboard on a tray, and it's pretty simple, but it works pretty well. They sent me one. It's somewhere over here in a big pile of junk off camera, but I'm not going to use that because, like I said, we're going to do a ton of 3D printing. But what all can you 3D print? Well, like I mentioned earlier, there's a pretty lively scene of 3D printing 10-inch rack enthusiasts who have put up a lot of different designs of their own for everything from switches and routers to ITX and Raspberry Pi enclosures to enclosures from little 1-liter form factor PCs from like Lenovo and Dell. I've even seen a full 3.5-inch drive shelf with sliding trays. There's also other little drawers and mounts and adapters for displays and fan ducts and all sorts of stuff. Pretty much anything you can imagine putting in a little home lab like this, there's probably a design that someone has put out there. And the few things that I kind of wanted but didn't find, well, I just made my own designs, and it was actually pretty easy. One of the first things you're probably going to have in a home lab is a simple network switch, and I had this little cheap TP-Link gigabit switch here, and it was really easy to find a model for a variety of TP-Link switches, but one that would fit this. And this does have these little screw mounts, but I found that the little screw mounts don't really line up with my switch, but it kind of just fits pretty well on its own just with friction. So yeah, we have a little switch, and I guess we can, well, I'm gonna go ahead and take everything else out of this really quick. All right, all that metal junk's out of the way. And I should be clear, well, it might be clear at this point, but the rest of this video is just me putting stuff in this rack and talking about it. I got past the end of my script outline a few seconds ago, and so yeah, we're just gonna have some fun for the rest of this video. I'm just gonna be winging it. Let's see what happens. All right, I don't have any specific design for how this is gonna go, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and put this little switch up at the top, and then we'll just start working down from there. I will say one thing I don't like about the Rackmate T1 is the included screws. They're kind of nice because they're shorter than you probably need for more like standard rack gear, so it's a little bit quicker to screw them in, but they're also not magnetic, which is a huge bummer. Okay, cool. So we have our little switch. What next? Well, normally I would probably put some sort of little patch panel like this one, but I wanted to 3D print everything, and that was fortunately pretty easy because I also found a little keystone patch panel from, I have no idea because I forgot to write down who did all of these designs, but I'll make sure and have all of the credits for the designs and everything on the video, and I'll also have links to them down in the description if you're interested. But yeah, I have this little keystone patch panel here, which I filled with these red Cat 6 couplers. I probably should have maybe done like black for gigabit or white for gigabit and then red for 2.5 gig or something, but well, I just kind of liked the look of red, so I did them all in red. Oh, yeah, that screw's a little too short. There are some designs that use pretty thick panels, and so I found the little short screws that came with the T1 weren't quite long enough, so I had to grab some more standard screws, and this is one of those examples. Also, if you're wondering what I printed this with, I printed it with one of my 2 Bamboo Lab printers. This is really the most awkward way to screw this in. I printed it with my Bamboo Lab X1 Carbon, which they did provide me, along with an A1 Mini a while back. I didn't print with the A1 Mini because the print bed is too small, although you could print 10-inch parts with the A1, which is substantially cheaper than the X1 Carbon. I also didn't use the A1 Mini for even some smaller parts because it's currently out in my garage and it's really cold, and so it's still not good to print out there in the cold in general, but the X1 Carbon's enclosed, so I primarily printed with that. And then for filament, you probably shouldn't use PLA. PLA is typically like pretty easy to print with. It's kind of the most common like beginner filament to print with, and it's really great for a lot of things, but it's not good when it comes to heat. Even if it's not hot enough to like melt, it'll start to get warm and just sag and deform. And so, you know, something like this little switch here is going to get warm over time. And so you probably don't want to use PLA. So I printed all of this in PETG. And specifically, I used some black PETG from Overture. Not because it's really great, but it's really cheap. I think I bought 2 spools for like 25 bucks or something like that. And I think other than some misprints and some trial and error for some of like my prototypes, I think I was able to print everything that I put in this rack for those 2 spools. So yeah, about 25 bucks or so for filament to do this entire project is pretty cheap, but you can also get a variety of different filament. That's just what I used. All right, what's next? Well, probably I'm going to do some more networking here, but I'm going to skip that because I want to get to something that's a little bit different and not just switches and stuff. So one of the first things I wanted to try and do was rack mount something like this little HP Elite Desk G3 Mini. It's just a little 1-liter form factor, or the tiny mini micro, or whatever you want to call it. It's got an i5 6500T, but it also has, well, it's missing right now, but it has the ability to put a little 2.5 gig adapter in here. And my first thought was to try to build an enclosure for it. And I was originally going to try and actually just take the entire motherboard out of the case and like build a custom enclosure that's rack mounted. But then I realized that the actual screws for the CPU cooler screw into the bottom of the case. The screws for the CPU cooler screw into the bottom of the case, and I could do some like heat set inserts, but that was going to be a pain, so I was like, okay, I'll just keep it in the case, but I'll build a rack mount enclosure. And well, for that, I started to kind of get a little bit crazy where I had this idea to like, and this is like multicolored because I was just kind of getting rid of different filament. But yeah, I had this idea to build like a little case that actually like had a lid, and you could put the G3 Mini in here, but then it also had a little keystone jack, so you could like run a little jumper for the 2.5 gig or the 1 gigabit port on the back to the front. That way you can network from the front. And this ended up not working because, well, some of my measurements were a little bit off, and it honestly just was way too much filament for a simple task, and I ended up finding something much better. Once again, I have no idea who designed this, but as you can see, it's a little enclosure for a Lenovo. This is the M715Q Gen 2, I believe. But also on the sides, you can see it has these little keystone jack cutouts. I did have some issues printing with this batch of filament. It took me a little while to dial in some of the settings. Normally I don't have that much issue with Overture PETG, but this batch was giving me some issues. But I don't really care because the aesthetics aren't that important, especially on the inside of the rack. Now this model was actually for like an M720, I believe. And so there's a little back plate on the back that you would use to keep this attached, but the screw hole placement is slightly different. So as you can see right now, it stays in this way, but if you flip it over, it just falls right out. I could have pretty easily probably modified this design for just this little back piece that screws on to go where that screw hole was so I could mount it all in place. But I actually decided to just tweak this design a bit and came up with this, which pretty much looks exactly the same, but I made a few tweaks to the design. And I basically made this little kind of like beveled cutout here. It's hard to see, but it lines up with this little beveled bit here on the HP G3 Mini. And so if I slide it in from the back, it kind of hits a point where it just locks into place. And then I just made a modified version of that bracket from the Lenovo system, and it just goes on here. And then it has a little bit of wiggle room. There's not a lot of front to back wiggle room, but from side to side, there's a decent amount. But still, it's not too bad. And well, you're probably not going to notice it in this one video, so I think that's okay. So I think I'm actually going to install this next. And for this, I'm just going to need a few screws to secure the little back plate thing. Why do all 4 screws when you can just do 2? Now I just need to do little keystones on the front. Now, one thing about this design that maybe I should have tried to tweak with my modifications, these little cutouts for the keystone jacks are pretty tight. And well, it seems like from some other comments and my personal experience, once you put these in, they're not coming off. Oh boy. There we go. Yeah, it's upside down. Wait, no, I can't fix it. My design's upside down. Oops. Okay, so sadly, my design is actually upside down. So, well, it's only upside down in the sense that the Cat 6 jacks are upside down, so not that big of a deal. Oh, dang it. I did the jumpers backwards. I didn't think about proximity here, and so the gigabit NIC is much closer to the red one, and the black one's much closer to where the 2.5 gig will be once I actually put it in there. So it's not great, but I'll just have to remember that the 2.5 gig is actually the black one. So well, let's just get this screwed in and forget that happened. So yeah, I guess as long as you don't notice that these are upside down and they're wired up the wrong way and there's no 2.5 gig currently, this looks pretty good. Okay, obviously we have this big blank spot that I skipped, and that's because I wanted this to be another switch. Where did it go? Specifically this little 2.5 gig switch from Asus store. This just happens to be in my living room, and it was the easiest one I could steal for this video. But I didn't find a specific mount for this, and I probably could have pretty easily made one, but well, you can sort of see there's a lot of just wasted space here, kind of similar with this TP-Link up here. And I don't know, I just kind of wanted to see if there's a way that I could use more of the very limited space we have. So if I was able to mount this over to the side, we would have a little bit more room that, like, well, it's not that much room. Maybe you could squeeze a Raspberry Pi or something, but I actually had a better idea. And that's this little JetKVM. This guy is super cool. It's a little KVM, so you can plug this into a computer with HDMI and USB-C, and then through a web browser, you can have complete access to that machine. So not only can you, remote into the operating system to do whatever you want to do, you can also get access to the BIOS and like restart the machine and have access to it. I believe you can even use this to like upload an image to boot from. So if you want to reinstall an operating system remotely, you can. This guy has a lot of cool features. I was going to do a really short video just covering this, but I kind of got busy, and then actually when this first showed up, it didn't work. I think the firmware on it got corrupted somehow. This is a beta, so there might be some issues. It was actually really easy to fix the firmware issue. They have some instructions on their website on how to reflash the firmware, which was pretty easy to do. I did it on my laptop in just a few minutes, and then it worked great. So yeah, this is actually a really cool little KVM. I think right now it is a Kickstarter. They're crowdfunding currently. I don't think you could just go buy one of these, but I think it's like $70. I know Craft Computing had a good video on this, and I want to say there's a couple of other people that did, but there's some good videos. You can go check this out. I didn't get a chance to make like a full video, but I did like using it in the brief time that I've got to use it, and I thought it would be a great candidate for a little rack like this. So I actually came up with, where'd it go? I actually came up with this little guy, which, you can just go boop and slot it in. And then if you had, for example, just an empty rack space, or you had like a shelf for some other stuff, you could kind of squeeze this in next to it. But, well, that wouldn't really work if I also needed to rack mount this Asus store thing, because, well, I could do like just a shelf, but I didn't want to have it just open. So One of the beauties of 3D printing is it's pretty easy to learn some basic CAD and throw together something like this. So over here on this side, I can just slot in the little JetKVM, and then here in the middle, we can slide in the Asystor switch, and it does have some little screw holes down here, which that switch is not going anywhere. And if we slot this in here, how good does that look? This is starting to look a little cooler than I even imagined it would. Also, I know a lot of people are going to end up asking me what I used to do my CAD modeling and stuff. To be clear, I'm very much a beginner. I'm very new to CAD, but I use something called Onshape. It's actually browser-based. And the paid version is really expensive, I believe, but there's a free version that does come with the downside that basically all of your models are publicly accessible if people want to get to them, but they would have to like specifically search for them. And really, to me, it's not that big of a deal because any model that I make that's decent, I'm probably going to publish anyway. So yeah, make your own decision. But if you're interested in getting into some basic CAD, you can check out Onshape. There's a lot of great tutorials from different people on YouTube. And I'm pretty much a complete beginner when it comes to CAD, but I was still able to slap together something like this, which, man, I think looks pretty darn cool. And we've only filled up half of the rack so far. We still have the other half, but there's a few things we haven't covered at all. First of all, we don't have a router, and second of all, we don't have any type of like storage really. For a router, there's a lot of options of people having similar things to this little bracket up here for something like some of the TP-Link like business routers and some other like Ubiquiti stuff. But for me, well, I'm going to be a little bit lazy and just stick this guy up on top. This is a Dynalink router that I flashed with OpenWRT in one of my last videos. And yeah, it's a little cheap to just kind of stick it up here on top, but hey, this little shelf exists, and this router works pretty well, and it gives us a lot more room in our rack for some other stuff. Now, there are some pretty solid models out there, it seems, for 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drive storage. You could also go a very simple route and just buy like a DAS enclosure and put a shelf and just kind of... Do I have something? Here we go. You could just like put a simple shelf in here, chuck a DAS or a NAS in, and even if you didn't like the open look, you could probably just take a picture of it, go in Onshape, and make a little panel that you could just stick over the front to kind of enclose the whole thing. So yeah, this would totally work, but I had a much more fun idea. If you've watched the channel for any amount of time, you know I love to work on old desktop systems and stuff a lot of times. And a lot of times they have optical drive bays that aren't being used because we don't really use DVD drives and such. And so I like to replace those sometimes with different adapters like this guy here, which is a little 3.5-inch 5-bay drive cage, which fits in 3 5.25-inch optical bays, or this, which I actually got recently from an awesome viewer who's local to me and offered to donate a lot of hardware he was getting rid of. And he actually had this IC cage, which has 3 2.5-inch bays, which is pretty cool. And this fits in just a single 5.25-inch bay. And so I had the idea of, well, let's just grab some adapters and print them off to put them in here. But surprisingly, I couldn't really find any 5.25-inch to 10-inch rack adapters. So I also just hopped into Onshape and made some of those as well. Now, because I specifically had these two adapters, I made a 3 5.25-inch adapter and a single 5.25-inch adapter. I probably should make a 2. That way there's like kind of a whole set, and I'll put those online. But for now, I just have these 2. So yeah, I thought this would be a pretty cool way to use something like this. And then there's some screw holes, so we can line it up flush on the front of the case. No, I hate these non-magnetic screws. Okay, I'm probably a little bit biased, but I think that looks pretty freaking sick. Now, obviously, this only works if we have a system to hook it up to, and I guess you could potentially make this work with something like this little HP Elite desk, but that would probably be a big pain in the butt, so you'd probably need to have a different system to run this. Oh, hi, Ruth. You would probably need a different system to run this that has some sort of ITX motherboard. And well, we're kind of running out of space. We would also have to figure out how to power this whole thing. So I think considering everything else I put in here, I'm gonna scrap this. And instead, I'm gonna go with this little guy, but still I'm going to need some sort of system to run this. So I have essentially a little NAS. And for that, I thought it would make more sense to go with a little ITX board. And so I printed this enclosure here and dropped in the little ASRock N100 DC ITX. It's not a great motherboard. There's definitely some issues with it, but it's a simple little ITX board. It does have 2 SATA ports already, plus an M.2 slot that we can add a SATA adapter, PCIe slot, so we can have 2.5 gig networking, and it should be a very simple little system that we can run a basic NAS off of. Once again, off the top of my head, I have no idea who designed this case. It should be listed on the video and it'll be down in the description, but it's a really cool design. It has a little spot for a power button as well as some USB ports, and it has this little spot for a half-height PCIe slot. Now, I did have some issues printing with the first layer that was a bit odd, but I think this was like a 7-hour print and I was already sort of behind on this video, so I didn't feel like reprinting. So yeah, the front doesn't look perfect, but it should work. Now for the 2.5 gig card, I just have a little 2.5 gig PCIe card, so we can just slot that in. And then for the power button, I grabbed a little 12mm momentary switch, which also has wiring for an LED, so hopefully we'll have a little power LED. And obviously these wires are not terminated, nor are they nearly long enough to actually reach the front panel header, but I can fix that here in a second. Next, we have these USB port cutouts, which the person who made this model posted a link for the correct adapter. I ordered what appeared to be the same adapter, or at least I thought I did, and then what showed up was something completely different that obviously isn't going to fit that. And I considered maybe taking like a Dremel tool to that to try to cut part of it off and then glue some stuff together or 3D print a little adapter to make it fit. But, well, I think I'm just gonna live with having a couple blank holes in the front of this case for a little bit. It's a little less than ideal. I'm nervous it's going to be a bit of an eyesore, so maybe I might rethink it. If we have time, maybe I can fix it. But yeah, for now, I think this is going to go into here. We can put our little drive bay right underneath it. Ah, these stupid screws. To be fair, it doesn't help that I'm trying to do this awkwardly from the side. Okay, so now we have 1 gig switch, little patch panel, 2.5 gig switch, KVM, a little PC here for running some Proxmox or something. We have a little NAS system that we'll be able to hook up to a little 2.5-inch drive bay down here with 6 drive bays. And then honestly, for this bottom one, I think I'm just going to leave that open. That way I have some room to put potentially some cabling or some fans down here or something. And I didn't print off any single patch panel covers. I actually just printed off these little half unit covers because, well, I at one point thought I was going to use the little half U patch panel. And so this is going to kind of fill that out. So I think I'm just going to screw these in really quick. Cool. I think what we can probably do is actually mount like a little 120mm fan or something down here at the bottom and hook it up to this N100 system, just kind of blowing some cold air up to try to just kind of maybe force some cold air down to the bottom of this so it kind of eventually rises up through and exits out the top and stuff. Yeah, so that's the front of this. And so far, I think it looks pretty cool. Now we need to do the back though. Yeah, so here on the back, this is where I think 10-inch racks start to, well, show why they're kind of a pain. Even with cool bespoke 3D printed parts, you really just don't have a lot of extra wiggle room, and we still have to put in 5 power adapters we're going to have to fit into here, as well as just all of the rest of the cabling, and potentially a little fan down here. So that's not going to be super fun. Now to try and help make things a little bit easier, I printed off a variety of these little cable runner things. So you just kind of screw them in like so. We have a variety of these that we can use to route some cables through. And then I also designed these little guys here, which kind of do the same thing. You can just kind of stick them on, but they kind of stick out and they have a variety of these cutouts here so that you can loop some zip ties through them. And I'm gonna start trying to cable manage this and we'll see how well it goes.
1 day later.
Well, it went, and actually I think it turned out pretty decent. It looks pretty good, at least on the front. We'll get to the back here in a second. I did a few things between yesterday and today. First of all, I worked on this case for the little mini ITX system a bit. I drilled out a hole on the front of the case so that I could pass through a little barrel jack. I also made probably the jankiest splice ever to make the wires long enough for this switch to make it all the way to the front panel header. And I actually did get these 2 USB ports in place by cutting off a couple of the little screw holes and kind of making another screw hole, and then they don't look great, but I think it looks better than just a blank hole there. So the whole front of this ITX system is a little janky due to the weird print issues and everything else, but I didn't want to take another 7 or 8 hours to reprint it all. All in all, I still think it looks pretty decent, but everything else I think looks pretty darn good on the front. The back, well, hold on, let's just get to that. Yeah, the back is pretty messy. I will say these little cable guides I printed off and even my little bracket holder things that I made actually worked pretty well. I kind of like that all these cables are kind of constrained, but they're not to where I can't just pretty easily like take them out and work on them. These are they seem to do a pretty good job of keeping all the cables in place, still being able to work on it. I like that. Ended up just running all of the power cables down, and it was a little awkward because I realized I was gonna have a bunch of these little wall warts, but then it kind of hit me. Odds are you're probably going to run some sort of UPS with this, and there's nothing that you're gonna be able to really rack mount inside this, so odds are you're gonna have a little UPS sitting next to it. So besides this little mess of cables that I probably could have tidied up a bit more, it kind of makes sense that all the power cords just run down and then everything plugs into this UPS, which is sitting next to the rack. Even with some of the little brackets and everything, cable management in this little tiny rack is going to be pretty tricky, just because even if you manage things pretty well, just like trying to get your hands in to like work on stuff is pretty tough. But yeah, also I couldn't find the little 2.5 gig adapter for the M.2 E-key slot, so the HP Elite Desk is just running gigabit. And also I could only find 3 SATA cables that didn't have 90-degree adapters, and then it turns out I think one of those is busted anyway, so of the 6 drives on the front, only 2 are working. I guess I could go out and buy 4 more SATA cables, but I'm not gonna worry about doing that for this because I'm probably not going to keep this rack around, at least not in its entirety. So yeah, that didn't seem to really be worth the money or the time. But yeah, I did mount a little 120mm fan down at the bottom of the case. It seems like it actually can't support anything larger than 120mm. I don't know how effective it really is, considering it's just sort of pushing air into the bottom of the little drive cage. I guess if you were to like fully enclose the back and then put some fans at the top, that would probably help to like pull air through, but considering all the cable management you'd have to do, that's gonna be a huge pain in the butt. So I don't really know how effective that fan bracket is, at least with my setup, since there's not a lot of airflow above it, but hey, it's there. Oh yeah, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but to actually power the little 6-bay drive cage, on that ITX board, there's a little SATA power header that has a cable that splits off into 2 SATA power connections, and so I'm actually powering that off of this little ITX motherboard. Also, the only patch cables I had for networking were either like little 6-inch guys, little like 1-foot guys, or some 7-footers. So I had to just, to get cables up here to the router, I had to just bundle up some 7-footers and I just zip tied them to the top of the case, which I will say the top of this actually is a pretty good spot to mount little power bricks or whatever else if you're trying to cable manage and get stuff out of the way. This does a pretty good job if you have some space up at the top. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the back. I'll go ahead and turn it back around. That way it looks pretty again. The JetKVM is super cool. I have it hooked up to the Elite Desk. There's one issue I ran into, which is that the only USB ports I believe on this that support standby power are on the front, and I wanted it to be running from the back, so it turns off whenever the system turns off, which is a little bit less than ideal. You could get like a little splitter so that you could power this via like a USB adapter while still having it plugged in, which is what I did when I got this set up. And yeah, it worked really great for installing Proxmox onto this. I was able to just go to the IP address that's on the front of the display, and then from there I had full KVM access and was able to install Proxmox. And then obviously I don't have a KVM for the little NAS system down here, so I just plugged into the HDMI port just to confirm that when I plugged this USB flash drive in, Unraid would boot properly, and I got that set up as a basic NAS with only 2 drives of my 6 potential, but hey, I have a NAS, I have a little Proxmox machine with a KVM, I have 2 switches hooked up to my OpenWRT router with some flexible patching options for if I have, you know, Ethernet run to a variety of different rooms in my house and I want to be able to patch and unpatch those. Oh, and I don't know how correct this is, but you can probably see we're typically only drawing around like 30 watts at idle. I think this is a little low on this APC maybe. When I had the system plugged into like my kilowatt earlier, it seemed to be a little closer to like 40. But yeah, still a pretty efficient little home lab. I don't know how reasonable this is. Oh, I didn't even mention the price for the Rackmate T1. It's, I believe, right around $180. They did run this on a Black Friday sale for like $145 or something like that, and I wish I would have had this video up in time for that in case you were interested. But maybe just keep your eyes peeled for one. It seems like you might be able to get a deal for around like $150 or so if they go on sale. And so really when it comes down to value, it's kind of tricky. This is not the most rational thing in my opinion. This is not the most easy thing to work on. It's not the best bang for your buck. But if you're pairing this with some 3D printing, I have to say, this is the most fun I've had working on home lab stuff in quite some time. It was a lot of fun planning things out and figuring out where things would go and finding models and designing models. And the end result is really satisfying. And so if you're looking for some like fun tinkery project stuff and you want to build a home lab, and you also like 3D printing, I feel like this is a really fun way to go about it. And yeah, I said this wasn't really the most like rational approach. It's not the easiest thing to work on. It's not the easiest thing to upgrade, but at the same time, it's still very much usable. This could definitely be a really solid little home lab. So if you're looking for something that works, but it's also going to be fun to play with, this could be a fun approach. Also, if you've never done any 3D printing and you're looking to get into it, I highly recommend Bamboo Lab printers. To be clear, they did send over my 2 printers for free so that I could use them for projects like this one, but I still recommend Bamboo Lab to like friends and family because I think they're really great at just being able to get a 3D printer that just sort of works out of the box and you can use as a tool. So I highly recommend them, but to be clear, yes, they did send my printers for free. The A1 Mini, their cheapest printer, is a great deal. However, it's not going to be big enough to print anything really for a 10-inch rack like this. So the cheapest printer you can get that would be able to print stuff like this is the standard A1, which I believe comes in at $350, which I think is a great deal, so you might consider checking that out if you're interested in getting into 3D printing and doing some stuff like this. If you're interested in picking up a 3D printer or the Rackmate T1, or if you want to check out any of the models that I featured in this video, I'll make sure to have links for those down in the description. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a little bit different, and honestly, it was pretty much just me having fun for a few days. But still, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, maybe give me a like, maybe consider subscribing if you're not already. That's about it for this one, so as always, thank you guys so much. Stay curious, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.